There is a specific kind of alone that nobody talks about. Not the alone of an empty house on a Friday night, not the alone of a crowded party where you know everyone but feel nothing, not even the alone of a bad breakup or a long distance or a friendship that slowly rotted without anyone bothering to say goodbye. The kind of alone that Charles Bukowski spent his entire life writing about is harder to name than any of those, and that is precisely why it cuts deeper. It is the alone of a person who has been awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of a room that smells like old carpet and cheap takeout, knowing with absolute clarity that the life happening around them is not the life they were supposed to be living. You have felt it. You have felt it, and you probably never said anything about it to anyone, because you already know how the conversation goes. You say something real and they say something reassuring and nothing changes, and you feel more alone than you did before you opened your mouth. That is the loneliness Bukowski understood at a cellular level, and that understanding is why his words have outlasted nearly every other writer of his generation, who was considered more serious, more literary, more deserving of the prizes and the reviews and the dinner invitations he never got. Most people who mention Bukowski at all will tell you he was a drunk, a misanthrope, a man who celebrated failure and wallowed in filth. And that reading is so shallow that it almost deserves pity. What Bukowski actually was, at the core of everything he put on paper, was a philosopher of solitude, a man who looked at the unbearable ache of being a human being in modern society and refused to dress it up, refused to make it comfortable, refused to pretend. That connection was easy or guaranteed, or even necessarily desirable in its conventional forms. He looked at alone and he said, "This is real. This is where I live, and I am going to make something true out of it, because the alternative, which is pretending, which is performing, which is smiling at people you do not like in rooms that make you feel suffocated, is a kind of death that happens slowly and is somehow worse than the real thing." That was not nihilism. That was not giving up. That was, if you are willing to sit with it long enough, one of the most radical acts of self-preservation that a human being can perform. The question that most people never ask is this: what if being alone is not a problem you failed to solve, but a condition you were never actually supposed to escape? Not because human connection is worthless, not because love is an illusion or community is a lie, but because the relentless social pressure to fill every moment of silence with noise, every hour of solitude with company, every uncomfortable thought with distraction, is itself a kind of violence done to the interior life of a person who feels things too much. Bukowski felt things too much. He grew up being beaten, being ugly by conventional standards, being poor, being rejected by publishers for years and years before anyone gave him a platform. He did not develop his relationship with solitude because it was romantic or because he read the right self-help book about introverts. He developed it because it was survival, because the world kept closing doors and he had to find a way to live in the hallway. And what he discovered in that hallway changed the way he wrote about everything. Consider what he said and how he lived in those small rooms in Los Angeles, working at the post office, coming home exhausted and somehow still writing, still putting words on paper late into the night when any sensible person would have stopped. The writing was not separate from the solitude. The writing was how he processed the solitude, how he made it mean something, how he turned the raw fact of being a person that society had largely decided to ignore into something that resonated so deeply that decades later you are watching a video about it, because something in you already knew what he was talking about before you ever read a single poem. The alone he described was your alone too, maybe. You have never worked a sorting job at the post office. Maybe your failure looks different from his. Maybe your particular version of being outside the acceptable life looks completely different on the surface. But underneath, the texture of it, the weight of it, the specific quiet of sitting with yourself when the world has made clear it is not particularly impressed with who you are, that part is the same. That part has always been the same. If any of this is landing somewhere deep in your chest right now, if you are watching this and something in you is saying, yes, that is exactly it, that is the thing I could never explain, I want to ask you something personal. How long have you been carrying this feeling alone? How many years have you spent in rooms full of people, nodding along, performing fine, going through the motions of a life that looks acceptable from the outside while something quieter and more honest inside you slowly went unheard? If that question hits close to home, go to the comments right now and write this: I found my people. You do not need to explain anything else. You do not need to tell your whole story. Just that phrase, because someone else is going, is to scroll through those comments tonight, feeling exactly what you feel, and they are going to see your words and feel, maybe for the first time in a long time, that they are not the only one. That matters. That is not nothing. That is, in its own small way, exactly the kind of connection Bukowski believed in, the kind that does not demand you perform, the kind that meets you where you actually are. Now here is the part that even people who love Bukowski tend to miss, the part that recontextualizes everything and makes his philosophy not just dark poetry for people who drink too much, but something genuinely useful for living. Bukowski did not celebrate loneliness as an end in itself. He celebrated honesty, and loneliness was simply the most honest condition he knew. The man spent decades watching people lie to themselves in the most ordinary ways imaginable. They took jobs they hated. They stayed in marriages they had outgrown. They voted for things they did not believe in. They wore clothes that were not them, and laughed at jokes that were not funny, and aspired to versions of success that, if they ever stopped for 30 seconds to actually examine, they would realize had nothing to do with anything they actually wanted. And they did all of this because the alternative, the honest alternative, felt too dangerous, too exposed, too alone. Bukowski's argument, if you want to call it that, was that the aloneness you feel when you refuse to play the game is far less corrosive than the aloneness you feel when you spend your whole life playing it. One kind of alone is clean, the other kind rots. Think about what it actually means to be surrounded by people who do not know who you are. Think about the specific exhaustion of conversation that is all surface, all weather and sports results and what you did on the weekend. Conversation that floats above the actual life you are living, like oil on water, never mixing, never touching anything real. Most people live their entire lives inside that exhaustion, and they call it normal because everyone around them is doing the same thing, and if everyone is doing it, then it must be fine, it must be how things are supposed to work. Bukowski looked at that collective exhaustion, and he said no. He said the price of that kind of belonging is too high. He said he would rather be the strange man in the cheap apartment, with the typewriter and the bottle and the cats, than the acceptable man at the dinner party, with the right opinions and the right jokes, and the slow interior collapse that nobody mentions, because everyone is too polite and too afraid. He chose the honest version of alone over the dishonest version of together, and he documented that choice with such precision and such fury that it has been speaking to people ever since, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. The deeper revelation is this: solitude, when it is chosen rather than imposed, when it is inhabited honestly rather than endured desperately, becomes the most fertile ground a person can stand on. Everything Bukowski ever wrote came out of those hours alone, not the drunk hours, not the hours of performance or bravado, but the quiet ones, the ones at the desk, the ones where he looked at the blank page and decided to tell the truth about whatever he was carrying. The work was the proof that solitude was not a wound, but a tool, not a punishment, but a practice. He was not a man who had nothing to say to the world. He was a man who refused to say anything to the world unless it cost him something to say it, and that distinction is everything. People who never spend time alone never learn what they actually think. They learn what they are supposed to think, what is required of them, what gets them approved of and included and invited back. The interior voice, the one that knows things, the one that sees clearly. That voice only speaks in silence, and it only speaks honestly when there is no audience to perform for. There is something Bukowski understood about failure that the entire self-improvement industrial complex has spent decades trying to convince you is wrong. He understood that failure is information, not motivation, not a stepping stone, not a temporary setback on the road to eventual triumph. Actual information about who you are and what matters to you and what the world is actually like, as opposed to what you were told it was supposed to be. Every rejection he received from publishers told him something real. Every bad job, every bad relationship, every night that ended worse than it began, all of it was data, all of it was material, all of it went directly into the work. He did not transcend his suffering in the way the inspirational posters want you to transcend. Yours, he metabolized it. He sat with it in the small hours, and he let it become sentences, and those sentences became the thing that lasted. The suffering did not go away. The aloneness did not go away. But it became productive in a way that suffering never becomes when you are too busy running from it. And so here is what you are left with. Here is what this whole conversation has been building toward. The choice in front of you is not between being alone and being together. That is a false binary, and it always has been. The real choice is between being honestly alone, which means knowing, which means yourself, sitting with yourself, hearing yourself without the constant interference of performance and approval, and being dishonestly together, which means spending your finite life surrounded by the static of other people's expectations, while the real you goes unwitnessed and unspoken. Bukowski chose honestly alone again and again, until the work he made from that choice became something that millions of people recognized as the truest description of their own interior life they had ever encountered. That is the paradox at the heart of everything he wrote. The more honestly alone he was, the more connected he became to everyone else who was suffering in silence. The less he performed, the more he was recognized. The further outside the system he lived, the more essential he became to people who had spent their whole lives inside it and felt every single day that something was wrong but could not name what. If something in this video cracked something open in you, if you are walking away from this with a thought you did not have before, do something small but real. Give this a like, not because it helps an algorithm, though it does, but because there is someone out there tonight who needs to hear exactly what you just heard. And the like is the thing that helps this reach them. You do not know who they are. You do not need to. You just know what it felt like before you found words for what you carry, and that is enough of a reason to pass this forward. And if you want more of this, if you want a place where the conversation is always honest and the ideas are always worth sitting with, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly the person you are, the one who thinks too much, feels too much, questions too much, the one who never quite fit the life that was offered and is still trying to figure out what a real life looks like on their own terms. Every video here is built for that person. Every video here will give you something to think about that actually matters. You belong here. Stay.